Texas, 1944. The desert wind rolled across the plains like a furnace, carrying dust, heat, and the faint metallic rattle of a U.S. Army truck. Inside the truck's wooden bed, a group of German women sat blindfolded, their hands trembling in their laps. The air smelled of sweat, hay, and diesel. Each jolt of the truck made their hearts skip. They whispered to one another in clipped German, voices tight with fear. The world outside was America, enemy land, a place their propaganda said was full of cruelty, punishment, and humiliation. The truck came to a stop with a hiss of brakes. A soldier shouted, "All right, ladies, step down careful now." One by one, they were guided off the back, boots crunching against gravel. When the cloth was lifted from their eyes, they blinked into blinding Texas sunlight. The first thing they saw wasn't chains. It wasn't rifles raised. It was the horizon, wide, endless, glowing with gold. Behind the barbed wire fences, cattle grazed lazily. A few guards leaned on wooden posts, cowboy hats tipped low, eyes squinting against the light. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was so thick it hummed. One of the German women, perhaps 22, a former nurse from Hamburg, clutched her bag tightly. She had expected to be dragged, interrogated, maybe worse. But instead, an American sergeant in dusty boots simply said, "Welcome to Texas, ma'am. You're safe here." His accent bent around the word ma'am in a way she'd never heard before. Polite, almost gentle. They didn't believe it at first. They thought it was a trick. German officers had warned them that the Americans would treat them like animals, that the women soldiers, the helpers of the Reich, would be publicly shamed, perhaps enslaved. But these men, these sunburned cowboys in olive uniforms, seemed uninterested in revenge. One offered them canteens of cold water. Another tried to make a joke, saying, "Don't mind the heat, ladies. You'll tan faster than us." No one laughed, but the tension cracked just enough for air to move again. As they walked past the camp gate, the landscape seemed almost unreal. Instead of gray ruins or muddy trenches, there were cotton fields swaying under blue sky. Instead of bomb sirens, the distant sound of a train whistle and the low moo of cattle. The camp itself looked more like a ranch than a prison. Wooden barracks, open yards, and even a small library marked with a hand-painted sign, POW Reading Hall. That first night, the women sat in their bunks, whispering about the strange civility of their captors. One said, "They must be preparing us for something worse." Another replied, "They gave us clean water and soap. Maybe they want us alive for propaganda." The nurse from Hamburg stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above, its blades slicing through the hot air, and thought, maybe everything they told us was wrong. The next morning came the real shock. The guards gathered the group outside the camp fence and gestured toward a row of horses tied to a rail. Saddles glinted in the morning sun. "You're riding out today," said a corporal, chewing on a straw. "Got to get you to the work site somehow." The women froze. The words didn't register. Riding? They had expected trucks or chains, not horses. The corporal looked confused by their fear. "You can ride, can't you?" he asked. None answered. Then, without ceremony, one cowboy swung himself into the saddle, his boots clicking against the stirrups. "All right, folks," he said. "Let's get y'all started." He patted the neck of his horse, which snorted softly. Another guard brought a mare toward the German nurse, holding the reins out gently. The animal's eyes were calm, brown and steady. "She won't bite," he said with a half-smile. "Her name's Daisy." The nurse took the reins like someone touching a live wire. Her hands shook. To them, horses were symbols of status or military display, something ridden by officers, not prisoners. But here, in the American dust, the horses were just transportation. The nurse swung her leg awkwardly over the saddle, nearly falling off. The guards chuckled, not unkindly. "Easy now," said one, steadying her arm. "You'll get the hang of it." When they finally rode out, a strange silence filled the air. The women's fear was slowly replaced by astonishment. The land stretched in every direction, golden fields under the endless sky. A hawk circled overhead. For the first time in years, there was no thunder of artillery, no scent of smoke. Only the creak of saddles, the rhythmic clop of hooves, and the faraway hum of cicadas. It was disorienting. They were prisoners, yes, but free in ways they hadn't felt even in Germany. They passed through small Texan towns where locals stared, half curious, half amused. Children pointed, whispering, "Mama, are those real Germans?" The women avoided eye contact, afraid to see hatred in their faces. But instead, an old woman outside a general store lifted her hand and waved. The nurse hesitated, then waved back. At midday, they stopped under a mesquite tree for rest. The guards handed out sandwiches wrapped in paper. One of the women refused to eat. "I won't take food from the enemy," she said. The Texan corporal shrugged. "Suit yourself, ma'am. More for the horse, then." He tossed the sandwich to the mare, who devoured it greedily, making the group laugh despite themselves. The corporal grinned. "See? Even Daisy's a diplomat." That night, as the Texas stars burned white above the camp, the nurse lay awake listening to the low murmur of guards talking by the fence. Their accents were thick, words lazy, melodic. She didn't understand all of it, but she caught fragments. Ranch? Mama's cooking? Rain needed bad. There was no cruelty in their tone, no anger. Just ordinary life. The sound made her ache in a way she couldn't explain. The next morning, one of the guards, a young man named Cooper, brought her a worn leather glove. "Helps with the rains," he said. "Don't want you blisterin' your hands." She accepted it with hesitation, then nodded. "Danky," she whispered. He blinked. "Don't know what that means, but you're welcome." Within days, word spread among the women. These Americans were strange. They didn't shout. They didn't humiliate. They treated prisoners almost like guests. Some even laughed with them during chores. One guard asked them about Berlin. Another tried to teach them poker. The women began to question everything they had believed. Was this softness real or just another form of control? The nurse began to write in her hidden notebook at night. "The Americans do not hate us. They confuse us. They smile and we don't know how to respond. It is easier to be hated. But to be treated kindly, it makes you see your own reflection, and it hurts." Every day blurred into the next. Sunrise, horses, cotton fields, windmills spinning in the distance. The irony deepened with each sunrise. Captured by the enemy, yet safer than they had ever been under the flag they once served. They began to talk quietly among themselves about what would come next. Rumors drifted through the camp. Germany losing ground, Allied advances, the bombing of cities they once called home. Fear and shame mingled with gratitude. The nurse dreamed of her mother's voice, her brother's uniform, and the American sky above her. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon in a blaze of orange, Cooper looked over the fence and said softly, "You know, ma'am, my daddy used to say the desert don't judge nobody. It just burns everyone the same." She didn't understand every word, but the meaning reached her anyway. They had been told Americans were monsters. But in Texas, the monsters wore cowboy hats and offered them horses instead of chains. When German POW women saw their guards saddle horses, they thought it was a trick. In Texas, captivity came with sunshine and saddles. What happens when fear meets Southern hospitality? The morning sun hit the Texas horizon like a flare, burning through the mist that hung over the camp's fences. The German women rose early, their bunks creaking as they folded gray blankets and straightened their narrow sleeping quarters. The air smelled of dust, horse sweat, and the faint sweetness of mesquite. Outside, a guard called out names from a clipboard, his voice echoing across the yard. The women stood in a line, hands behind their backs, trying to look composed even as the heat shimmered around them. They were learning that discipline here didn't come from threats. It came from quiet expectation. The first few days had been chaos. Horses spooked easily, tools broke, and tempers flared under the unforgiving sun. One woman fell from her saddle and refused to get back up until the American corporal, Cooper, walked his horse beside hers for the rest of the day. Another burned her hands lifting irrigation buckets, and the guards wrapped them gently with gauze instead of shouting. Confused them. This wasn't what prisoners were supposed to feel. The Americans didn't behave like conquerors. They acted like hosts trying to make their strange guests feel useful. Every task had a rhythm. Work in the morning, meals at noon, lessons or chores in the afternoon. Instead of cruelty, the Americans offered structure. Keep busy, stay steady, Cooper would say. Time runs faster when you got purpose. The women didn't know if that was kindness or manipulation. Back home, order had meant survival under the Reich. Here, it felt almost like dignity. They were assigned to pick cotton in nearby fields, rows stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Each woman wore a borrowed hat and long sleeves against the sun. The fields buzzed with insects, the earth hot enough to sting through boots. At first, they worked in silence, each one haunted by thoughts of Germany. The brothers who had gone missing, the cities they'd left behind, the families who might never know where they were. But the silence didn't last. The Americans sang. It began with one of the guards humming low under his breath, some country tune about trains and rain. Then another joined in, his rough voice carrying across the rows. The melody was strange, simple, and full of longing. The women glanced at each other, trying not to react. But one of them, a tall girl from Munich, couldn't help it. She began to hum along, softly, mimicking the rhythm. When the song ended, one guard tipped his hat toward her. "You got good ears, ma'am," he said. She blushed. That small moment broke the invisible wall. Within a week, the women began trading words, English for German, over buckets of cotton. "Water," one said, pointing to her canteen. "Wasser," another replied, tapping her chest. Laughter replaced silence. They began to understand each other, if not through words, then through gestures, smiles, and shared exhaustion. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Cooper rode up to the nurse from Hamburg, the same one who'd been afraid to touch the reins on her first day. He dismounted and handed her a new saddle strap. "Leather tore again," he said. "Think you can fix it?" She frowned. "I am not a worker of leather." He smiled. "You're about to be." He knelt beside her and began threading the strap through the buckle, showing her each motion. Rain started to fall in warm, heavy drops. She followed his movements carefully, her fingers brushing his for an instant. Neither spoke. When the strap held firm, he nodded. "See? You got it." The storm broke open over the fields, soaking them both. The guards shouted for everyone to take cover, but the nurse stayed for a moment, face turned upward to the rain. After months of bombs and ash in Europe, the clean rain of Texas felt like baptism. Cooper watched her quietly, then handed her his hat. "Keep the water out of your eyes, ma'am." She hesitated, then took it. That night, thunder rolled far away as the women sat in the barracks, drying their uniforms over small stoves. The nurse pulled out her notebook again. "The guards speak kindly. They call us ma'am, as if we were women, not enemies. I cannot decide if this is weakness or strength. Perhaps both." Over time, the Americans began trusting them with small freedoms. The barbed wire gate was sometimes left open under supervision when they worked nearby. One woman, a former typist from Cologne, asked permission to see the camp library. A sergeant nodded and led her to a small wooden building filled with donated books. Mark Twain, Dickens, even Goethe. She stood there trembling, her hand resting on the spine of Faust. "You got that one back home?" the sergeant asked. She smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "We all do." It was in that moment that the Germans began to realize something profound. Their captors weren't trying to erase their culture. They were trying to remind them of it. The Americans didn't hate the German language or music or art. They hated what the war had done to it. But the kindness also brought unease. Every gesture of humanity forced the women to confront their own beliefs. Late at night, they whispered about it. How they had cheered for a leader who promised greatness, and how it had led them here, halfway around the world, riding horses under a foreign sky. One woman wept quietly, saying, "If my father could see me now, he would call me a traitor. But maybe he was wrong." There were moments of tension too. A new group of guards arrived 1 week, harsher, less patient. One of them mocked a woman's accent, calling her Fräulein Stormtrooper. Cooper intervened, telling him, "We ain't here to break 'em, just to keep 'em breathing." The other guard scowled but said nothing. The women noticed. Respect was something earned quietly, not demanded. As weeks passed, the nurse's bond with her horse, Daisy, grew stronger. She spoke to the animal in German while grooming her. "You are luckier than us," she'd whisper. "You don't know sides." Daisy would nuzzle her shoulder, snorting softly, and she would smile for the first time in months. Riding no longer felt like submission, it felt like a strange kind of freedom. In the nearby town, rumors spread about the lady prisoners. Locals began driving out to see them ride during work hours. Some brought pies, others letters. The Americans were proud of their conduct, showing the world that decency was stronger than hate. A Texas newspaper ran a small story: German women POWs treated humanely at local camp. The headline caused outrage in some corners, pride in others. But within the camp it meant something more, a quiet affirmation that humanity still mattered, even here. Then came the first letter from Europe. A Red Cross courier brought it to the nurse. Her mother's handwriting, shaky and faint. "Your brother is missing. The city is rubble. We are alive." She sat for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. Cooper saw her by the fence and asked softly, "Bad news?" She nodded, eyes wet. He didn't offer words, only handed her a small handkerchief embroidered with the initials CC. She kept it folded in her pocket afterward, a strange token of empathy from the other side of war. By early 1945, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted. The women no longer feared the guards. They feared their own thoughts. They had begun to wonder who the real prisoners were, the ones behind the wire, or the ones still trapped by ideology an ocean away. The irony stung deeper every day. The nurse wrote in her notebook again, "They are kind. It is unbearable. I am beginning to admire them. Perhaps this is how defeat truly begins." The Texas wind carried that thought across the camp as dusk settled. Lanterns flickered, horses snorted, and the guards' laughter echoed faintly in the distance. The women watched them, half in fear, half in longing. Kindness had become its own form of power, a power that dismantled hatred more completely than any bullet ever could. But kindness can be more dangerous than cruelty, because it makes you question everything you were told. By the spring of 1945, the Texas wind had grown softer. The air smelled of rain and wildflowers instead of dust. The camp no longer felt like a battlefield's echo. It felt like a forgotten ranch where time moved slower than the war itself. The German women had stopped flinching at every shout. They laughed more easily, spoke more English, and sometimes forgot they were prisoners at all. Yet beneath the calm, a strange tension lingered. News from Europe traveled slowly, but every whisper brought them closer to the inevitable collapse of the Reich. The war that had taken them across an ocean was dying, and they didn't know who they would be when it was gone. The first rumor came through a Red Cross worker. Berlin was under siege. Some women refused to believe it. Others went pale and silent. One evening, the nurse from Hamburg stood by the fence as the sunset bled across the horizon like a burning city. "It can't be true," she said quietly. Cooper, sitting on a nearby fence post, took off his hat. "It'll be over soon," he said. "Maybe that's a good thing." She shook her head. "For who?" That night, the guards gathered around the radio in their quarters. The crackling voice of a BBC announcer declared that Allied troops had entered Germany from both east and west. Through the barracks walls, the women could hear the muffled cheer of the Americans. Some of them covered their ears. One cried out, "They're celebrating our graves." But others didn't cry. They just stared into the dark, the realization sinking in that the Reich, something they'd been taught to revere as eternal, was crumbling into dust. The next morning, the camp felt different. The guards' jokes were quieter. The women's work slower. A few of them stood in line for breakfast with red-rimmed eyes. Cooper walked past, offering a nod instead of a word. He knew better than to gloat. In war, victory could feel as heavy as defeat. Days later, the confirmation arrived. Hitler was dead. The announcement came through a telegram pinned to the mess hall door. The guards read it first. Then the German interpreter translated it aloud. The camp fell utterly silent. Some women gasped. One fainted. Another whispered, "Lies." The nurse simply stared at the paper until her vision blurred. The man who had promised them glory had vanished into smoke. That evening, she found Cooper by the corral, oiling his saddle in the fading light. "You look like you lost someone," he said gently. "I lost an illusion," she replied. "Is that worse?" He paused, thinking. Sometimes illusions die harder than people. In the following days, the women began to drift through their routines like ghosts. No one knew what would happen next. Would they be sent home, tried, forgotten? But the Americans didn't change their treatment. They still offered coffee, still opened the gates for work, still smiled as if nothing had shifted. The world was ending, and the Texans just kept being kind. That strange consistency was both comforting and unbearable. Then came May. The radio buzzed one afternoon, and a guard shouted across the camp, "It's over! The war's over in Europe." The announcement spread like wildfire. Some guards cheered. Others stood quiet, heads bowed. The German women gathered in small circles, their faces unreadable. For them, victory had no meaning. It was survival that mattered now. The nurse sat by the horse fence, watching the sky turn silver. She whispered to Daisy, "You were lucky. You don't know what surrender means." That night, instead of lights out silence, the camp filled with music. Someone brought out an old phonograph, and swing records played from the guardhouse. American soldiers danced under the stars, their laughter echoing against the fence. A few women watched from the shadows, torn between resentment and fascination. One of them murmured, "They celebrate peace while we mourn our country." Another replied, "Perhaps they celebrate life itself." A few days later, Cooper and another guard approached the German group. "You're free to ride beyond the fence today," he said. The women exchanged glances, unsure if they'd heard right. "Supervised, of course," he added. "But you've earned a bit of air." The nurse climbed onto Daisy's back, heart pounding. For the first time, she rode beyond the barbed wire into open Texas land. The wind tore through her hair, carrying the scent of sagebrush and sun. Freedom tasted strange, sweet, terrifying, undeserved. They stopped by a hill overlooking a field of bluebonnets. The sight took their breath away. One woman dismounted and picked a flower, turning it over in her hands like something sacred. "So much beauty," she whispered. "While our cities burn." Cooper looked at them and said softly, "Maybe this is what peace looks like before it remembers what war did." Over the next weeks, something remarkable unfolded. The women began helping voluntarily with ranch chores, tending to horses and crops. The guards stopped watching as closely. The fence still stood, but it no longer meant what it once had. Some local families invited the POWs to church picnics, carefully at first, then openly. The women baked bread with local mothers, played music with their children, even taught them German lullabies. What began as captivity had turned into coexistence. Word spread across Texas of the lady prisoners, who had found kindness behind barbed wire. Newspapers ran human interest stories describing their transformation. "Enemies no more," one headline read. Some Americans wrote letters condemning the camps for being too soft, but others defended them. "If we act like the monsters they fear," one editorial said, "then we prove them right." The nurse noticed how Americans seemed to fight with decency as fiercely as they fought with weapons. She admired it, even envied it. One night, she asked Cooper, "Why do you treat us so kindly? We are the enemy." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Ma'am, my daddy fought in the last war. He told me once, if you win and lose your soul doing it, you lost anyway." Those words stayed with her. Every kindness, the glove, the food, the laughter, became a reminder that strength didn't always look like force. She realized the Americans weren't soft. They were strong enough not to hate. That was a kind of victory her country had never understood. As summer came, The camp shimmered in golden light. Horses grazed lazily, guards leaned against fences, and the once fearful German women now carried themselves with quiet confidence. They no longer felt humiliated, they felt human again. Some even joked with the cowboys, trading phrases in broken English. "Howdy," one would say. "Guten Tag," came the reply. Laughter bridged what war had tried to destroy. One Sunday, the town held a small rodeo and invited the POWs to watch. The women sat in wooden bleachers as the cowboys rode bucking broncos across the arena. Dust swirled, the crowd roared, and someone handed the nurse a bottle of lemonade. She sipped it, watching Cooper in the ring, his hat low, his lasso spinning. When he dismounted and walked past, he tipped his hat. "See?" he grinned. "Told you horses aren't so scary." She smiled back, something warm flickering in her chest. That evening, the sky turned crimson, and the German women rode their horses alongside the American guards one last time before curfew. No words, no orders, just the sound of hooves striking earth and the hum of wind in the grass. For a few fleeting minutes, they weren't prisoners or victors. They were just riders beneath the same endless sky. Over 400,000 German POWs were held across America during the war, and Texas alone housed tens of thousands. Not one female prisoner was executed or abused. The statistics were cold, but the truth behind them burned bright. Decency had prevailed where vengeance could have ruled. As the sun dipped low, Cooper rode ahead and looked back at the women silhouetted against the horizon. "You'll remember Texas," he said quietly. "Maybe not the fences, but the way the sky looked when you rode free." The nurse nodded. She would. That sky would follow her home, long after the war's ashes settled. That was the turning of the tide. Not with guns or victory parades, but with forgiveness, patience, and the strange power of a cowboy's kindness. In a world rebuilding itself from hatred, that gentle defiance felt like the loudest victory of all. The summer of 1946 carried a heavy stillness across the Texas plains. The war was long over, but its echoes still clung to the camp like dust that refused to settle. The German women had grown used to the rhythm of life in captivity. Morning sun, horses, cotton fields, the smell of rain on dry soil. But now came the hardest chapter of all, leaving. Orders arrived quietly, typed on official paper, stating that repatriation would begin within weeks. Ships would sail from New Orleans and New York, carrying them back to the ruins of what was once home. When Cooper read the list aloud, the camp fell silent. No one cheered. No one smiled. Freedom, when it finally came, didn't feel like victory. Felt like loss. The nurse from Hamburg packed slowly, folding her few possessions. A comb, a worn notebook, and the leather glove Cooper had given her months before. She ran her thumb over the initials carved into it, CC, and felt her throat tighten. Around her, others did the same, each woman clutching something symbolic. A book, a ribbon, a handkerchief, a photo taken with the horses. They had come here terrified of chains, but now they feared the open world waiting beyond the barbed wire. Their last night in the camp was quiet. The guards didn't patrol as usual. Instead, they gathered by the fence with guitars and bottles of cola, playing old folk songs under the moonlight. The women listened from their barracks, their windows open to the sound. One of the songs, a slow, aching tune about going home, made several of them cry. Cooper stopped by the nurse's door before midnight. "Ship leaves Tuesday," he said softly. "You'll get there before winter." She nodded, unable to speak. "Take care of yourself," he added, hesitating. "You're tougher than you look." The next morning, a line of army trucks waited outside the gate. Horses whinnied as if they sensed what was happening. The women stood in formation, carrying small duffel bags and Red Cross parcels. When the gate swung open, they didn't rush through it. They lingered, turning one last time to look at the camp. The guard towers, the dusty yard, the windmill creaking against the dawn. For all its fences, it had been a place of strange mercy. Before she climbed onto the truck, the nurse approached Daisy's corral. The horse snorted softly, pressing her nose against the fence. "Danke, mein Freundin," the nurse whispered, stroking her muzzle. You carried me farther than I deserved. Cooper stood nearby, hat in hand, pretending not to watch. When the nurse turned to him, she managed a small smile. "Goodbye, Texas," she said in halting English. He grinned faintly. "Texas'll miss you, ma'am." The convoy rolled out under a sky the color of pale gold. Dust rose behind the trucks like smoke from an old battlefield. Inside, the women sat in silence, hands resting on their knees, watching the horizon pass. The land seemed endless, but every mile brought them closer to a Europe they no longer recognized. When they reached the port, the air smelled of salt and coal. Massive ships waited at the docks, gray hulks lined with soldiers and cranes. American officials stamped papers, checked manifests, and issued rations for the long journey. The nurse looked down at her identification tag, POW number 2893, and felt like it belonged to someone else. The wind tugged at her hair as she climbed the gangway. On deck, she looked back one final time. The coastline shimmered in the distance, vast and sunlit. Somewhere beyond those plains, Daisy was grazing, and a cowboy was tightening his saddle for another day. The ocean crossing took weeks. The women slept in narrow bunks below deck, listening to the ship groan against the waves. They spoke in low voices, sharing memories of Texas. The smell of the fields, the sound of the radio, the way the Americans had treated them like people instead of prisoners. "Do you think they meant it?" one woman asked. "The kindness." The nurse nodded slowly. "Yes, that's what made it hurt so much." When they finally reached Europe, the contrast was brutal. The ports were blackened, the air thick with ash and hunger. Germany was not the home they had imagined. It was rubble, broken walls, and silence. Families were scattered, cities split by occupation zones. The women were processed, questioned, and released into a country that no longer had a center. Some were accused of collaboration. Others were simply ignored. The nurse returned to Hamburg and found her childhood street reduced to dust. Her mother had died of illness months before. Her brother's name was listed among the missing. For a long time, she said nothing about Texas. The memory felt too unreal, too bright against the grayness of post-war life. But as the years passed, she began to write again. In her small apartment overlooking the ruins, she opened her notebook and began to record everything she remembered. The horses, the guards, the rainstorm, the night they learned Hitler was dead, the moment she realized kindness could feel like punishment. She wasn't alone. Across Germany, letters and memoirs began surfacing from former POWs held in America. They spoke of fair treatment, of compassion, of humanity preserved amid chaos. Historians would later call it one of the most remarkable moral contrasts of the war. How the U.S., even while fighting totalitarianism, refused to abandon its own principles. For the women who had lived it, the lesson ran deeper than politics. It was personal. They had seen what hatred built and what dignity could rebuild. When interviewed decades later, one of the women from the Texas camp said, "We arrived terrified of monsters. We left wishing to be more like them." Another wrote, "They won our respect, not through power, but through decency." The nurse never saw Cooper again. She often wondered what had become of him. If he'd gone back to his ranch, if he'd married, if he still remembered the German woman who couldn't say goodbye without tears. She kept the glove he'd given her in a small box. The leather faded, the initials still faintly visible. Sometimes she took it out and held it, the way one might hold a relic of faith. In the early 1950s, she found work as a teacher, helping rebuild a school destroyed during the bombing. Her students were children of both victors and vanquished, learning side by side under a flag that had once divided the world. On the classroom wall, she hung a map of North America. When the children asked why, she only said, "Because that's where I learned what freedom really means." Years later, as an old woman, she visited the United States again through a cultural exchange program. She traveled by bus through the Southwest, and when she reached Texas, she recognized the smell of the air immediately. The dry sweetness of the prairie, the hum of cicadas, the way the sky seemed to go on forever. She found the old site of the camp near Hearne, now overgrown with grass. Only a few concrete foundations remained. She knelt there, pressing her hand to the earth. "You changed me," she whispered, "and I never said thank you." She mailed a letter afterward to the local historical society, enclosing her wartime diary. It was later displayed in a small museum with a plaque that read, "The enemy who found peace in Texas." Visitors still stop to read her words, written in careful German script, describing the day fear met kindness and lost. The irony of it all had come full circle. The women who arrived expecting chains were given reins instead. The land they feared became the place that taught them mercy, and the soldiers who were supposed to guard them became teachers of compassion. The nurse's final entry in her diary read, "Freedom is not the end of captivity. It is how you choose to treat the ones who cannot fight back." In the years that followed, historians would argue about the moral codes of war, about Geneva Conventions and the psychology of compassion. But for those who lived through it, the truth was simple. Decency had survived where hatred was supposed to reign. When she died in 1989, the glove was found beside her bed. Inside it, a folded note. "To CC, thank you for teaching me that the strongest hands are the ones that never close into fists." Freedom had come full circle. The fences were gone, the horses long dead, the desert winds changed. But the lesson of Texas endured. The monsters they feared had shown them their humanity. By the end of the war, America had held over 379,000 German prisoners of war, and not a single one of the women was executed. They were repatriated, educated, and in many ways transformed. It became one of history's quiet triumphs. That even in victory, mercy prevailed. They had arrived terrified. They left changed. And the world, bruised and bleeding, was left with a question that still lingers today. Would we show the same humanity if the roles were reversed?